We've all heard of Adolf Hitler and his horrific war crimes. But have you ever stopped to wonder why he lost? I mean, despite being one of the most evil people in history, he did manage to take over much of Europe. He also got as far as Ukraine before finally kicking the bucket. So how did this genocidal maniac lose the war? I ask this because many people today share some of his ideologies and want to make the world a better place for white people. Most historians agree that the invasion of Poland was a huge mistake. They had lost almost all of their air power and their navy was in shambles. Some historians argue that the invasion of the Soviet Union was a brilliant tactical move, while others claim it was a catastrophic blunder. The truth is that it was both. Yes, it was a brilliant tactical move because it caught the Soviets completely off guard. Of course, there are a lot of other factors that contributed to Hitler's downfall, like the fact that he was a terrible military strategist, or the fact that most of his generals were afraid to defy him. But if you want to know more about those, I'll have to get back to work. And German forces managed to advance hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. But it was also a catastrophic blunder because Germany had severely weakened itself by invading the Soviet Union. It took over a year for the Germans to capture Moscow, and by that time, the Soviets had already mobilized over 1 million troops. To make matters worse, the Germans had failed to secure their supply lines, which meant that they couldn't sustain their troops in the harsh Russian winter. The combination of these two factors led to Germany's defeat on the Eastern Front. To make matters worse, France had fallen and Britain was on the brink of collapse. This was Germany's best chance to win the war. But instead of crushing the Allies once and for all, Hitler made some crucial mistakes. First, he wasted time. He spent nearly a year planning an invasion of Britain when he could have easily finished off the British by launching a full-scale invasion. Second, he underestimated the British. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, it became clear that Britain would not be joining the war on the Eastern Front. This gave the Soviets some much-needed breathing room, which ultimately led to Germany's defeat on the Eastern Front. In fact, some historians argue that this single action started World War II, and they would be right. The British and French declared war on Germany 2 days after the invasion, and within a week, the Soviets had also joined the war on Poland's behalf. By 1943, it had become clear that Germany was losing the war. At that point, Hitler's only hope was to somehow force the Allies into accepting a negotiated peace. But here's the thing, the Allies weren't open to negotiations. In fact, they had met at the Trident Conference in 1943, where they had agreed that Germany would have to be completely defeated. If Hitler wanted to change that, his only option was to launch a massive surprise attack that would force the Allies to consider peace talks. And he had the perfect weapon to do that, the V-2 rocket. The V-2 was the world's first long-range ballistic missile, and it was capable of reaching London, Paris, and even New York. Had Hitler launched a massive V-2 attack on the major Allied cities, he might have been able to force them to accept a negotiated peace. But he didn't, and the war ended with Germany's unconditional surrender. If Hitler had just left Poland alone, it's likely that the war would have been delayed by at least a few years. And by that time, Germany would have been in an even stronger position. You see, Poland wasn't really a threat to Germany. In fact, Hitler had originally planned to invade Poland in 1935, but when France and Britain increased their military spending, he decided to wait a few years so that Germany's military could catch up. Had he stuck to that plan, the war would have started in 1935, and in that scenario, Germany would have likely won. You see, back in the 30s, the French and British were determined to avoid another war, so they didn't put up much of a fight. In fact, the British and French made several attempts to appease Hitler, like the time he annexed Austria, and they didn't do anything about it. Hitler was only able to get away with this because he started The war in the 1940s, when Britain and France had become much more powerful. With the threat of Soviet intervention, Hitler had no choice but to postpone his invasion of Poland. And this ended up costing him the war. Just kidding, I made that last part up. But the truth is that Hitler's ideology was actually pretty popular in the 1930s and 40s. In fact, it was uncommon for people to join the Nazi Party simply because they wanted a strong leader who could fix the country's economic problems. And let's be real, Germany was in bad shape after World War I. They lost the war, their economy collapsed, and they were forced to pay billions of dollars in reparations. So it's no surprise that Hitler was elected in 1933 with a landslide victory. But despite the fact that he had widespread support, Hitler ended up losing the war. So what happened? Well, there are a lot of factors that contributed to Germany's defeat, but I think it can be summed up with 4 simple mistakes. Mistake now: 1. Hitler's invasion of Poland. Now, this isn't exactly a controversial statement. Mistake now: 2. Not finishing off the Allies after the Battle of France in 1940. Hitler had the Allies on the run. Mistake now: 3. Invading the Soviet Union. This is probably the most controversial decision on this list because there are a lot of differing opinions. And finally, mistake no 4, not developing the V-2 rocket. So those are the 4 mistakes that I believe led to Germany's defeat in World War II.